and welcome to this World Insight special program, the second DPRK U.S. Summit. I'm Tian Wei. We are broadcasting in our studio from downtown Hanoi. Moments ago, DPRK leader Kim Jong and U.S. President Donald Trump met again 8 months after their historic visit and also meeting in Singapore. Before we begin our discussion, take a look.
Lights, cameras, action. With smiles and handshake, leaders from the U.S. and the DPRK opened their second summit in Hanoi. Kim and Trump shared an evening banquet on Wednesday. They sat down and had a brief one-on-one conversation ahead of the meal at the city's historic Metropole Hotel.
I am certain that a great outcome will be achieved this time that will be welcomed by all people. I will do my best to make that happen.
I'm satisfied, you're satisfied, we want to be happy with what we're doing. But I thought the first summit was a great success, and I think this one hopefully will be equal or greater than the first. And we made a lot of progress, and I think the biggest progress was our relationship is really a good one.
Both arrived in Hanoi on Tuesday. Air Force One carried the U.S. President across the Pacific, and the DPRK leader's personal train traveled across China to reach Vietnam. Before their bilateral meeting, Mr. Trump met with the Vietnamese President Nguyen Phu Trong and the country's Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc. Mr. Kim is also expected to meet with Vietnamese leaders during his first official visit. He's the second DPRK leader to set foot on Vietnam since the visit of his grandfather Kim Il-sung 55 years ago. Kim and Trump will hold talks on Thursday, joined by their respective delegates, and it remains to be seen how much, if any, headway will be made during the second summit.
For more on the Kim-Trump summit in Vietnam, we are having a very strong panel in Taipei for us. Zheng Lin, assistant professor at the College of International Relations at Rimitsukkan University. In Washington, D.C., Michael O'Hanlon, senior fellow from the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, and also director of the Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Last but not least, in Beijing studio, Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. I want to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, on this very important day. Even though the summit was supposed to happen on the 28th, the 27th, two of them already shook hands and talked to the public. Mr. O'Hanlon, what do you make of the words used by President Trump as very significant, probably even more?
Well, I was happy to see that Mr. Trump knows that he's got to aim for even bigger accomplishments in this summit. In other words, just a repeat of positive atmospherics does not really get us very far. I think a lot of people are hopeful that there's a possibility here for progress, and I think we're seeing some signs of possible flexibility and compromise from both North Korea and the United States. But that doesn't equal any kind of actual progress. And we know that right now North Korea continues to build nuclear weapons, and there's still a state of war on the peninsula, and there are still huge militaries on both sides of the DMZ. So we cannot take too much solace in the positive atmospherics. So I was glad to hear President Trump talk about how he aspires to an even greater success. That implies that he wants concrete accomplishments.
Ms. Lin, though, South Korea has been very instrumental over the past 1 year or two, trying to put everybody together, particularly DPRK and the United States. When you heard Chairman Kim in front of the press and the world talking about he will try his best in a way, and he praised President Trump as courageous to come to the second summit, what do you make of it?
Again, I agree with the other panelists. Again, Mr. O'Hanlon, you just mentioned that it looks like both sides made a kind of compromise to make concrete, actual progress. So I expect that too. And it looks like so far, I mean, that they just started this 2 days summit with a very good mood. I mean, again, they of course, you know, they greeted very pleasantly. And according to the President Trump's Twitter, I mean, he said like my friend, Mr. Kim Jong-un. So all the signs, I mean, they sound so far pretty good. And I think South Korea also would like to remain as hopeful as we can.
Well, you always mention the word as hopeful as we can. I hope we'll always maintain that spirit, Ms. Lim. Let me go to Mr. Jong in Beijing. You heard today, earlier before the two leaders shook hands with one another, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about he hopes that this talk will be step toward one another in a way that the two sides walking ever closer to each other. But the question is, whether that will be achieved. Mr. Jong, are you skeptical, or are you still come to this discussion with a curious mind for tomorrow's discussion?
Well, I think I'm as hopeful as my two previous panelists that this time. I think to the personal...
How to measure that?
Well, I agree with I think our Korean panelists that it seems that the mood is good. The personal chemistry between the two leaders seems is also growing. So that shows that I think we can be a little bit more hopeful that there will be something concrete, substantial would come out if the two sides continue to uphold the spirit of mutual sort of accommodation, give and take, and in the sense that it is certainly the two leaders has made great efforts, personal efforts, by investing their personal sort of capital for the success of this summit.
Well, we heard several key words said by the three of you. Flexibility, accommodation, compromise. These are all words importantly in the negotiation. Mr. O'Hanlon, though, can you be a little bit specific as to what extent the U.S. will be flexible? Before you say anything about it, let me just read very briefly what President said today at that meeting. President Trump said, your country, referring to DPRK, to the DPRK leader, has tremendous economic potential. Unbelievable, unlimited. I look forward watching it happen and helping it to happen. We will help it to happen. End of quote. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, what extent flexibility, accommodation, what does that mean to the U.S. side?
Well, we heard Steve Biegun a few days ago say that even though the goal is complete denuclearization, that does not mean that we cannot do anything at all until everything has been completed. In other words, there can be incremental steps. And I think the most natural way to get started is for North Korea to verifiably dismantle its nuclear production capability so that it cannot make any more bombs, its centrifuges, its plutonium infrastructure, and do all that under international inspection. And then in exchange for that, the UN sanctions that were imposed over the last 3 years or so could be suspended and then lifted. This would not be a complete deal because, as I envision it, North Korea would still keep most or all of its existing nuclear weapons, and some sanctions would stay in place because we would not yet have achieved our ultimate goal of denuclearization. But I think that would be a huge step forward for both sides. We would be of the confidence that North Korea could no longer improve or expand its nuclear arsenal, and North Korea would be able to resume most of its trade with regional partners, even if some of the U.S. sanctions and other sanctions remained in force. So I think that's a very good compromise for both sides, and that's where I hope we can start to move in the coming hours and days.
But there's one crucial thing, as you may know, Mr. Jong. When DPRK denuclearized, that's, in a way, once the step is taken, there's no going back. However, the UN sanctions and the economic sanctions coming from the other economy, for example, U.S., can always come back easily. So there is something that really has to be measured out if Pyongyang is thinking about its own fate, isn't it, Mr. Jong?
Yes, that's exactly I think the argument North Korea has been making. That I think it's been complaining, or it's been stating that for the past few months, North Korea has made quite a lot of, for them, substantial steps towards the goal of denuclearization, and a lot of them, or most of them, are irreversible. But as far as they are concerned, the corresponding measures are not coming. If those who have been coming, they are sort of reversible. So I think the Chinese has always been advocating that a kind of parallel sort of track would be certainly very much important. And North Korea, I think, is certainly looking for ease or lifting of economic sanctions, but it also would like to have something more, like the agreement of the announcement or declaration of the end of the war, and finally the starting of the beginning of the talks of the peace regime on on Peninsula.
Right. But having said that, though, Ms. Lim, if you even look at what can be done economically, because President Trump today seems to be very much emphasized on the U.S. role about making the DPRK economy become an impressive one and a significant one, unlimited one. Those are words used by President Trump. But exactly how? And just as denuclearization is not done by one day, that could not be done by one day either. So what do you think should be the steps U.S. take now?
Again, the meaning of venue itself, again, Hanoi or Vietnam, that does imply the future role of the United States for the North Korean economic development. Again, Mr. Trump keeps emphasizing, again, the Vietnamese model as a good example or case study for the North Korean economic development, which means, again, Vietnam, of course, used to fight with the United States, but now they, of course, they accomplished the rapprochement, and after the rapprochement, again, the Vietnam opened up the economy, and that was almost like indispensable, very necessary step to bring in the foreign direct investment, including, of course, American capitals. So I think, their selection, again, the selection of venue itself, it implies that kind of, possible future path for the North Korea as well. And also, at the same time, we need to be careful because now, today, again, the President Trump's political challenges, domestically, he faces lots of, political challenges, especially from the Capitol Hill, which means, again, lifting the those American sanctions, maybe politically can be more difficult. That is why, again, the South Korean government suggested, why not, again, inter-Korean economic cooperation can be a good card for the American White House, more specifically speaking, to play with. So we'll see. But again, it does have several meanings, I think.
Mr. O'Hanlon, in a hurry or not in a hurry, anyway, the President Trump was in a hurry going back from his dinner to a hotel tonight, at least because the hearing of Michael Cohen was going on right now. So will the President in a hurry to compromise and accommodate and also try to make things happen during this time's meeting, the second summit? What do you think?
It's an interesting question. On the one hand, any legal trouble the President might have here in the United States is separate from any progress he would make in Korea, and even if he won a Nobel Peace Prize for a denuclearization agreement, that's not going to prevent him from getting into legal trouble if he indeed broke the law. On the other hand, politically, if there is a sense that he is in trouble, then he might very well want to change the conversation and have some very positive news from Vietnam in regard to the Korea issue. And so at a legal level, it doesn't really help him to talk to Kim Jong-un, no matter what happens. But at a political level, it could help him change the topic. And his popularity right now in the United States is not that high, but it's also not that low. He actually does have a chance to win re-election next year, and therefore every potential accomplishment does matter in regard to an electoral campaign that's really already beginning here in the United States. We already see a lot of Democratic challengers starting to make their attempts to get the Democratic nomination, so I'm sure this is not very far from President Trump's mind either.
But Mr. O'Hanley, if I could follow up, earlier you see the exchanges between the so-called lower level of diplomatic negotiations between DPRK and the United States did not at least bear much fruit in front of the public eyes. One would really wonder, for the second summit, where can the two sides really go without this groundwork? Well, you could mention, well, it's all about celebrity diplomacy these days, but even celebrity diplomacy, there has to be things concrete to work on. Mr. O'Hanley.
Yes, but I really do think that the basic deal that we've been talking about, at least you heard me advocate, I realize Professor Wong may not have quite the exact same view, Professor Wong, but I think Ms. Lin and I may have some similar views. There's a basic possible deal. North Korea keeps its existing bombs for now because, as you said, that's something that is important in their own mind for their protection, and they cannot easily get those back if they give them away. But they also concede that 30 or 40 or 50 bombs is enough, and now they give up their infrastructure, which they're not supposed to have anyway, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they had signed and then violated. So this is already a pretty big step for the international community to accept that North Korea would keep its existing nuclear bombs and then have many of the sanctions lifted and some of the investment opportunities offered to North Korea. That's not that hard to explain conceptually, and that's not that hard for the two leaders to talk about without a whole lot of preparation, without a whole lot of technical detail. If they can agree on that basic trade, then I believe their negotiating teams can fairly easily fill in the details later.
Jong, that was the name being mentioned many times before the summit begins. Actually, a lot of people are talking about maybe that's the starting point. But even Jong, we still remember many stories related to that, the back and forth things about it as a result of the entangled moment of the six-party talks many years ago. So, Ms. Lim, is that really the starting point? Is that the starting point for success? Is that too little step to take? That is really the question, isn't it?
Yeah, but probably North Koreans, they will say that, you know, we already demolished Punggye test site, and we also dismantled the Dongchangli test site. That's already a kind of big step from their point of view. Of course, we were not, you know, happy enough, I mean, to see just, you know, demolition of the two test sites. So in that sense, again, Yongbyon itself, of course, it depends on how you see the meaning of Yongbyon. But if we go back to the earlier comments made by Mr. O'Hanlon, Yongbyon means a lot because it does have the production capability. And it does have a symbolic meanings too. So political symbol, as a political symbol, it does have meaning, and at the same time it does have a meaning as a, again, actual capable producing facility. So technically, politically, in both ways, I think Yongbyon has kind of, you know, pretty important meanings. So again, it depends on how you see how you see the meaning of the Yongbyon, or how you see the result of this, you know, the second summit. But I would say, you know, if really they can concretely mention Yongbyon, if so, I think I would say it's a big step.
Mr. Rong Ying from China, you are too familiar with those names over the past decade or so about the DPRK nuclear issue. I want to ask you, though, from another perspective, that even if there's something like that in an agreement, let's just say, between the two leaders, DPRK, U.S., there has to be verifiable steps taken by the other parties participating in order to make sure that both sides would abide by their words and they would take the next round of steps. So in that regard, Mr. Rong, how complicated the process are we talking about? A six-party, the precedent that people could look at, or something else?
Indeed, I think the six-party talks and also the previous agreement that has been reached between the United States and North Korea, certainly I think we have to look at that, the problems, why they are not being able to implement it, what is the problems. But this time, I think we can be, as I said, looks like we are all hopeful, can be different. Different in the sense that the two sides seems showing the sincerity or readiness to do really something concrete. This is because I think, as I said before, that the two leaders are making taking their personal stakes. But more importantly, I think that we are now having a kind of different narrative, in the sense that North Korea has already claimed, stated, and to the outside world, but also equally important to the audience, I mean, people at home, that they've decided and they have made a kind of strategic shift towards development. For that to happen, they need a stable, favorable international environment and a normal relationship with the United States and other regional countries is very much important. So I think the question of trust, the question of implementation, and the question of those names, we may come up with some new names. Who knows? The U.S. intelligence community may come up with some names, and it will take a whole and long and a complicated process to verify, to argue. But whatever the case, I think this time, I think it seems that we are now having a different sort of narrative, and that's why I think while we keep in mind these complications, lessons, but we can be a little bit more hopeful.
A little bit more hopeful. That has been equally expressed by the three of you. It seems that we are getting somewhere, I hope,